A flight attendant named Olivia slapped an elderly black man, unaware that he was a William Blackwood. Just 2 minutes later, she faced the biggest reckoning of her career as Ruthless revenge struck. How would this encounter transform Olivia's life? Before we dive into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. James Thompson stepped into the first-class cabin of the airplane, his weathered hands gripping a well-worn leather briefcase. At 60 years old, his gray-white hair and kind eyes spoke of a lifetime of experiences. Despite being a William Blackwood, Sebastian's appearance was far from flashy. He wore a simple light gray suit, looking more like a friendly neighbor than a powerful businessman. As he made his way down the aisle, Sebastian nodded politely to the other passengers, his gentle smile putting people at ease. Though many had no idea they were in the presence of one of the richest men in the country, Sebastian preferred it that way. He had never been one for showing off or making a fuss. Finding his seat, Sebastian carefully stowed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and sank into the plush leather seat with a quiet sigh of relief. It had been a long day of meetings, filled with important decisions and weighty discussions. Now, all he wanted was a peaceful flight home. A flight attendant approached with a warm smile. "Can I get you anything to drink, sir?" she asked. "Just water, please," Sebastian replied softly. "Thank you." As she moved away, Sebastian gazed out the window at the bustling airport. Beyond it, he thought about how far he had come from his humble beginnings. Growing up, he never could have imagined flying first class, let alone owning his own company. Life had been hard, full of struggles and setbacks, but those challenges had shaped him into the man he was today. Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment, feeling grateful for all he had achieved. More than the money or the success, he was proud of the good he had been able to do in the world. His philanthropic work brought him more joy than any luxury ever could. The plane began to fill up around him, the quiet hum of conversation growing louder. Sebastian pulled out a book from his carry-on bag, looking forward to losing himself in its pages. As he opened it, he felt a sense of contentment wash over him. Here, high above the clouds, he could leave behind the pressures of his busy life for a few hours. Little did he know, this flight would be anything but quiet. As the last passengers boarded, Sebastian had no idea that his life was about to take an unexpected turn. The calm before the storm was about to end, bringing with it a challenge that would test his character and change his perspective forever. As Sebastian settled into his comfortable first-class seat, he breathed a sigh of relief, and the day's stress began to melt away. He looked forward to a peaceful flight, but his moment of calm was short-lived. Olivia, a flight attendant in her late 30s with perfectly styled hair and a crisp uniform, approached Sebastian's seat. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me, sir," Olivia said, her voice sharp and cold. "I think you may have wandered into the wrong cabin. The economy section is further back." Sebastian looked up at her, surprised by her tone. He smiled politely and said, "No ma'am. I'm in the right place. My seat is here." Before takeoff, as Sebastian walked from the lavatory to his seat, Olivia's eyebrows shot up, disbelief clear on her face. She glanced around at the other passengers, who were now watching the exchange with interest. "I'm going to need to see your ticket," Olivia demanded, holding out her hand, her voice dripping with skepticism. Sebastian felt a familiar ache in his chest. He had faced this kind of treatment before, but it never got easier. Still, he kept his composure, refusing to let Olivia's rudeness affect him. With steady hands, Sebastian reached into his pocket and pulled out his ticket. He handed it to her without a word, his face calm and dignified. Olivia snatched the ticket from his hand. She held it up to the light, turning it this way and that, as if searching for some sign that it was fake. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence. "Is there a problem?" Sebastian asked quietly, his voice steady despite the humiliation of being questioned so publicly. Olivia's eyes flicked from the ticket to Sebastian's face and back again. She seemed unable to believe that this man dressed so simply, looking so out of place, could actually belong in first class. "This ticket seems unusual," Olivia said, her voice dripping with suspicion. "I'll need to verify it with the gate agent." Sebastian took a deep breath, fighting to maintain his composure. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on him, some curious, others sympathetic, but he refused to let Olivia's behavior rattle him. "Take all the time you need," Sebastian said calmly. "I assure you, everything is in order." As Olivia stomped off to check his ticket, Sebastian closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about how far he'd come, about the struggles he'd faced and overcome. This was just another hurdle, another moment to show grace in the face of prejudice. He opened his eyes and looked around at the other passengers, offering them a small, reassuring smile. Sebastian knew his dignity and composure in this moment spoke volumes, far more than any angry outburst ever could. When Olivia returned with Sebastian's ticket, her face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. She thrust the ticket back at him, her hand shaking slightly. "Well, it seems the ticket is valid," she said through gritted teeth. "But there must be some mistake. Surely you meant to book a seat in coach." As the flight progressed, Sebastian kept a watchful eye on Olivia's interactions with the other passengers. He noticed how she avoided his section of the cabin, delegating tasks to other flight attendants whenever possible. When she did pass by his seat, her movements were stiff, and her eyes darted nervously in his direction. Sebastian observed Olivia's interactions with other passengers, noting the differences in her behavior. She was polite but distant with most, overly attentive to a few, and noticeably less friendly to passengers of color. Each observation was carefully filed away in his mind, forming a clearer picture of the woman who had rashly judged him. As the flight continued, Sebastian's mind worked on the changes he would implement. As unpleasant as this incident had been, it had given him a unique opportunity to witness firsthand the issues within the airline. He was determined to use this experience to create positive change not just for himself, but for all passengers who might face similar discrimination. Sebastian's heart sank as he witnessed another troubling incident unfold before him. And Grace Williams, her silver hair neatly tied back in a bun, struggled to lift her carry-on bag into the overhead compartment. She looked around, her eyes searching for assistance. "Excuse me," she called softly, her voice trembling slightly. "Could I get some help, please?" Olivia, who had been nearby arranging items on her service cart, briefly glanced up. Her eyes met the older woman's pleading gaze for just a second before she quickly looked away, pretending not to have heard the request. Just then, a white passenger a few rows ahead raised his hand. "Miss, could I have another pillow?" he asked. Olivia's demeanor changed instantly. A bright smile spread across her face as she hurried over to the man. "Of course, sir. I'll get that for you right away," she chirped, her voice dripping with enthusiasm. Sebastian's jaw clenched as he watched the scene unfold. The contrast in Olivia's behavior was stark and undeniable. He felt a deep sadness settle in his chest, not just for the elderly woman, still struggling with her bag, but for the larger issue at hand. Unable to sit by and watch any longer, Sebastian stood up and made his way to the elderly woman. "May I help you with that, ma'am?" he asked gently. Gratitude shone in the woman's eyes as she nodded. "Oh, thank you, young man. These old bones aren't what they used to be." As Sebastian carefully lifted the bag into the compartment, he couldn't help but notice Olivia watching from the corner of her eye. Her face was a mix of emotions: embarrassment, defiance, and perhaps a hint of shame. Returning to his seat, Sebastian's mind raced. This incident had solidified his determination. It wasn't just about addressing Olivia's actions anymore. There were clearly deeper systemic issues within the airline that needed to be tackled. He pulled out his tablet and began jotting down ideas for the changes he wanted to make. Training programs on diversity and inclusion, revamping hiring practices, establishing clear protocols for assisting all passengers regardless of their appearance. The list grew longer as Sebastian's vision for transforming the airline's culture took shape. As the flight continued, Sebastian remained focused on the troubling incidents he had witnessed. With a heavy heart, he pulled out his smartphone, determined to dig deeper into the airline's history. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he searched for any information about past complaints or issues. What he found made his stomach churn. Page after page of complaints about discriminatory practices from flight staff popped up. Sebastian's eyes widened as he scrolled through the seemingly endless list. Many of these complaints had been dismissed or given only a cursory response. "This can't be right," Sebastian muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. As he delved further, a familiar name caught his eye: Olivia. There were multiple complaints specifically mentioning her by name. Sebastian's jaw clenched as he read through the details. Passengers of color being ignored or treated rudely. Elderly travelers left without assistance. Even instances of outright hostility toward those who didn't fit Olivia's narrow view of a first-class passenger. One particularly heartbreaking complaint stood out. A young mother traveling with her mixed-race child had been subjected to Olivia's cruel comments and dismissive behavior. The woman's words leapt off the screen. "I felt humiliated and angry. My child asked me why the lady didn't like us." Sebastian believed that education was key to changing hearts and minds. He envisioned a program that would open eyes and foster understanding among all employees from the CEO down to the baggage handlers. "We need to start from the ground up," Sebastian murmured to himself, jotting down notes on his phone. He decided to focus especially on flight attendants like Olivia, who interacted most closely with passengers. These frontline staff members were the face of the airline, and their behavior could make or break a traveler's experience. Sebastian's plan began to take shape. He would launch the initiative quietly, without fanfare or public announcements. This wasn't about scoring points or making headlines. It was about real, lasting change. As he looked around the cabin, Sebastian's gaze lingered on Olivia. He felt a mix of emotions: anger at her actions, sadness for the pain she had caused, but also a glimmer of hope. Maybe, with the right guidance and education, even someone like Olivia could learn and grow. Sebastian knew that simply disciplining Olivia wouldn't be enough. It might satisfy his immediate desire for justice, but it wouldn't solve the deeper issues plaguing the airline. No, he needed to do more. He imagined a series of workshops where employees could share their experiences and learn from one another. He pictured team-building exercises that would break down barriers and foster empathy. And he saw a future where every employee, from the pilots to the gate agents, understood the importance of treating all passengers with respect and dignity. As the days passed, Sebastian received regular updates on the progress of both the investigation and the policy drafts. He reviewed each report carefully, making notes and suggestions. His vision for a more inclusive and respectful airline was slowly taking shape. The airline was still grappling with the fallout of recent events, but there was no turning back. He knew that real change could only come through persistence and a commitment to transforming the company culture from within. In one meeting, Sebastian emphasized to his team, "We're not just changing rules on paper, we're aiming to transform the entire culture of this airline. It's about creating an environment where every employee and passenger feels valued and respected." He looked around at his team, his face steady but determined. He could see their nods of agreement, but he knew this would not be an easy task. It would require patience, strategic action, and a deep understanding of what had gone wrong in the past. Olivia's day started like any other. She arrived at the airport early, her uniform crisp, her hair neatly pinned back. As she walked through the employee entrance, she noticed a few of her colleagues glancing her way and whispering to one another. Her heart sank, but she shrugged it off, assuming they were just gossiping about the latest office drama. She had always been proud of her professionalism, so the thought that her colleagues might be talking about her was uncomfortable but not surprising. When she reached her locker, an envelope was waiting for her. Olivia frowned, tearing it open with a sense of dread. Her eyes widened as she read the contents, a mandatory training session on cultural sensitivity. "What is this?" she muttered under her breath, her frustration bubbling up. "You've got to be kidding me." She crumpled the notice in her hand, her cheeks flushing with anger. She had been a flight attendant for over a decade, and she had always done her job well. The very idea that she needed sensitivity training felt like a slap in the face. She had worked hard to be one of the best, and now she was being told she needed to learn something she already knew. The thought of being forced to sit through training for something she considered unnecessary stirred a deep resentment within her. Throughout her shift, the notice weighed heavily on her mind as she served drinks and handed out pillows. Olivia couldn't shake the feeling of indignation. She had always prided herself on maintaining the high standards of first-class service. How dare they suggest she needed to change her approach, especially when she was already doing everything by the book. Her pride was hurt, and she couldn't let go of the anger building up inside her. During her break, Olivia vented to her friend and fellow flight attendant, Chloe. "Can you believe this?" she fumed, waving the crumpled notice. "They're making me go to some ridiculous sensitivity training, as if I don't know how to treat passengers properly." Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clearly unsure how to respond. "Maybe it's not such a bad idea, Beth. You know, sometimes we all need a refresher on these things," she said cautiously, trying to offer some comfort. Olivia stared at her friend in disbelief. "Are you saying I'm insensitive?" she snapped. No, Chloe backpedaled quickly. "I just mean, well, times are changing. Maybe the airline wants to make sure we're all on the same page." But Olivia wasn't having it. She stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't need to be on any page," she said firmly. "I know how to do my job, and I do it well. This is just a waste of time." She stormed out of the break room, her mind racing with defiant thoughts. She had to go to this training, sure, but she'd make it clear that she didn't need it. She'd show them all that Olivia Williams was a model flight attendant, one who didn't need any lectures on how to treat passengers. The thought of being forced to accept something she didn't believe in made her even more determined to prove her point. Little did Olivia know, her resistance to change was about to be put to the test in ways she never imagined. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city skyline, James Thompson sat in his newly acquired office at the airline's headquarters. His eyes were focused on the computer screen before him, filled with page after page of passenger complaints. He scrolled through them slowly, his brow furrowing with each new report of discriminatory behavior. Some complaints were about flight attendants being dismissive, others about passengers being treated differently based on race, age, or appearance. He could feel the weight of the problems bearing down on him, and yet he remained resolute in his vision. "This goes deeper than I thought," Sebastian murmured to himself, shaking his head. He knew the airline needed more than just cosmetic changes, it needed a cultural overhaul. He had spent the last few days reviewing not just Olivia's record but those of other flight attendants and staff members as well. The pattern was clear: complaints of unfair treatment based on race, age, and appearance had been piling up for years, with little to no action taken. The lack of accountability, combined with a long-standing culture of disregard for passengers from certain demographics, was a serious issue. It wasn't just about individual incidents, it was a systemic problem that needed to be addressed head-on. Sebastian leaned back in his chair, his mind working on solutions. He knew that mandatory training was just the first step to truly changing the airline's culture. He needed to create a system where every voice could be heard, where passengers and staff alike could feel safe and valued. It wasn't going to be easy, and it would take time, but Sebastian was committed to making it happen. He understood that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but he was ready for it. With determination in his eyes, Sebastian picked up his phone. "Rachel," he said to his chief of operations, "I need you to set up a meeting with our tech team. We're going to implement an anonymous feedback system for our passengers." Over the next few hours, Sebastian worked tirelessly with his team to design a user-friendly app. Passengers would be able to rate their experience and provide detailed feedback, all without fear of retaliation. The data would be collected and analyzed, allowing Sebastian to identify problem areas and address them swiftly. This feedback system would be a critical part of their transformation, giving passengers a direct voice in shaping the future of the airline. As the day wore on, Sebastian's focus shifted to the complaints against Olivia. He read through each one carefully, noting the similarities in her behavior across different incidents. It was clear that her actions weren't isolated events but part of a deeply ingrained attitude. She wasn't just a single bad apple, she was a reflection of a larger issue within the company. "We can't just punish her," Sebastian said to his HR director during a late afternoon meeting. "We need to give her a chance to understand and change." Together, they drafted a personalized improvement plan for Olivia. It included not just sensitivity training but also one-on-one mentoring sessions and community outreach programs. Sebastian hoped that by exposing Olivia to diverse experiences, she might begin to see the world through a different lens. He believed that real change could only come when people truly understood the impact of their actions and were willing to take responsibility for them. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his office, Sebastian reviewed the day's work. The anonymous feedback system was in development, the training programs were being expanded, and plans were in place to address individual cases like Olivia's. He knew that changing an entire company's culture wouldn't happen overnight, but as he looked out over the city, he felt a sense of hope. With patience, persistence, and compassion, he believed he could transform the airline into a model of inclusivity and respect. Sebastian smiled as he looked over the progress being made with the company's cultural transformation. However, deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy, and the public's scrutiny would continue. His mission was clear: he had to demonstrate to both the public and his employees that these changes were real and not just a superficial response to the crisis. It was a chance to show the world what true leadership and accountability looked like, but it required constant effort, focus, and the willingness to make difficult decisions. The media was relentless, and the negative press surrounding the airline had caused its stock to dip. Sebastian was well aware that the public would be watching closely to see how he handled the situation, but he remained resolute. In his mind, this was more than just a PR crisis, it was a turning point for the company's future. The changes they were making were going to take time, but he was committed to seeing it through. The internal investigation was ongoing, with Olivia at the center of it all. Sebastian's decision to let her go through the improvement plan instead of firing her outright had caused some mixed reactions among the board members and staff. Some supported his approach, believing in second chances and the power of transformation, while others questioned whether she could change at all. Sebastian's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a message from Janet, the head of HR. "Meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning to discuss Olivia's improvement plan. All documentation and framework are ready. We will begin the first training session next week. I will brief you after the session." Sebastian nodded to himself after reading the message. It was time. The first step in Olivia's journey of redemption was about to begin. He had faith in the process, but he also knew that change would not come easily, especially not for someone like Olivia, who had spent years in the company culture that perpetuated many of these problems. Olivia's day started with the usual routine. She arrived at the airport early, wearing her uniform and adjusting her hair, trying to hold on to the image of the professional she once believed she was. But as she entered the employee lounge, she noticed an unsettling shift. Colleagues exchanged glances and whispered, and they thought she wasn't looking. Olivia felt an unfamiliar weight pressing on her chest. It was as though the walls were closing in on her. The rumors were no longer just whispers, they were out in the open. Her heart pounded in her chest as she walked through the airport, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at her. The suspicion that people were talking about her behind her back was nothing new, but now it felt different. She had been through challenges before, but this was something else entirely, an investigation, and not just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. She had crossed a line, and now everyone knew about it. When Olivia reached her locker, she found an envelope with her name on it. She frowned, instinctively knowing what it was. Tearing it open, she found a mandatory training session notice about cultural sensitivity, directed specifically at her. Her breath caught in her throat. "What now?" she muttered to herself, her fingers gripping the paper so tightly that it crinkled. Her face flushed with anger as she crumpled the notice in her hand. She had been a flight attendant for more than a decade. She was well versed in the airline's standards, and the suggestion that she needed to undergo sensitivity training felt like a slap in the face. It stung, deep inside. It felt like an attack on her ability to do her job, on her years of experience. She had prided herself on her professionalism, and now, she was being told that it wasn't enough. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Olivia. As she worked, the notice sat in her pocket, a constant reminder of what was happening behind the scenes. She tried to keep her composure while serving drinks and assisting passengers, but the tension was palpable. Every time she made eye contact with a colleague, she felt as though they were silently judging her, waiting for her to make a mistake. It was during a break that Olivia found herself in a quiet corner of the lounge, talking to Chloe, one of her closest friends at the airline. "Can you believe this?" Olivia fumed, holding up the crumpled notice. "They're making me go to some ridiculous sensitivity training. Like I don't know how to treat people." Chloe hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "Maybe it's not such a bad thing, Beth. You know, sometimes we all need a refresher on this stuff." Olivia shot her a look. "Are you saying I need it? I've worked my ass off to get where I am. I don't need to be told how to do my job." Chloe seemed to shrink under Olivia's gaze. No. I didn't mean it like that. It's just, the world's changing, you know. Maybe they just want to make sure everyone's on the same page." Olivia's jaw clenched. "On the same page? I don't need to be on anyone's page. I know how to do my job. This is just a waste of my time." She stood up abruptly, storming off without another word. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had always been the one to uphold the high standards of first-class service. She was good at her job, she knew it. So why was she being singled out? Why did she have to go through this humiliation? Olivia's pride was hurt, and she didn't know how to cope with the feeling of being undermined by the very company she had served for so long. That evening, when she got home, Olivia couldn't bring herself to relax. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers in front of her, attempting to prepare for the sensitivity training. She scribbled down some notes, but every word felt hollow. How could she possibly face the training tomorrow? How could she admit that she had been wrong? "I can't do this," she muttered, pushing the papers away in frustration. She ran her hands through her hair. "I can't face all of them. I can't admit that I was wrong. Not like this." But deep down, Olivia knew she had no choice. This was the only way forward. It was her opportunity to redeem herself, but it terrified her. Her mistakes were too big to ignore now, and even though she resisted, she understood that she had to confront the truth. As she finally went to bed, her mind raced. The guilt she felt was overwhelming, and the thought of facing her colleagues the next day made her stomach churn. But she knew, deep down, that this was the first step on a long road to making things right. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the training center early. She tried to push the doubts aside as she stepped into the room. The atmosphere felt heavy, and it wasn't just because of the ongoing investigation, it was because the whole company knew about her involvement. Her co-workers' eyes lingered on her, filled with curiosity, some judgment, others simply waiting for her to say something. She tried to ignore the feeling of isolation creeping over her. The trainer, a cheerful woman named Sophia, greeted the group with warmth and enthusiasm, but Olivia couldn't bring herself to smile. She sat down, arms crossed, determined to get through the session without showing any weakness. But as the discussion began, she couldn't help but feel the sting of what was happening. The stories and examples shared in the session began to hit her in a way she hadn't expected. Sebastian, meanwhile, had been keeping track of Olivia's progress, watching from a distance. He knew that this was going to be a long and painful process, not just for Olivia, but for the entire company. He had seen the resistance in her, but he also knew that transformation wasn't something that could be forced. It had to come from within. He had seen glimpses of potential in her, but it was now up to Olivia to decide whether she would take the opportunity to grow. Sebastian had made it clear from the start that this was not about punishment. He had chosen this path because he believed that change was possible, not just for the airline, but for every person involved in the process. The results were uncertain, but Sebastian knew that the real test was yet to come. Olivia stood at the front of the room, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. The lights above seemed too bright, the room too silent. She tried to steady her nerves, but her hands shook as she gripped the podium. Everything was about to change, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The room was filled with her colleagues, her supervisors, and, most intimidating of all, the cameras that were now filming her every word. This wasn't just another training session. This was live-streamed to every single employee in the company, part of the new transparency initiative that Sebastian had put in place. Every eye would be on her, and every word she said would be scrutinized. Her heart raced as she looked into the camera, trying to ignore the panic rising in her chest. The truth was, Olivia didn't know what to say. How could she explain her actions? How could she admit how wrong she had been? "Hello, everyone," Olivia began, her voice quivering at first. "I'm Olivia, and I'm here to talk about an incident that happened on one of our flights." She paused, her throat tightening. The words felt like they were stuck, lodged somewhere deep inside her. "I made a terrible mistake," she continued, her voice wavering. "I treated a passenger unfairly because of the color of his skin. I judged him, and I was wrong." The tears she had been holding back for so long started to form, threatening to spill over. But Olivia pushed them down, forcing herself to continue. "I was wrong, so wrong," she said, her voice cracking. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about why I acted that way. It's not easy to admit, but I grew up in a place where these attitudes were normal. But that's no excuse. I should have known better. I'm sorry." Olivia's hands trembled as she wiped away a tear. She had wanted to say something that would fix everything, but she knew she couldn't. Words were never going to undo the harm she had caused. But she had to start somewhere. She had to show that she understood what she had done wrong and that she was committed to making things right. Just as Olivia was starting to show signs of real remorse, a commotion erupted off camera. The director of communications rushed in, whispering urgently to the producer. Olivia paused mid-sentence, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the worried expressions on everyone's faces. "Is everything okay?" Olivia asked, trying to stay calm despite the rising anxiety. The producer signaled for her to keep going, but Olivia could see the concern on their faces. She stumbled through the rest of her prepared statement, her mind racing with questions. Was she doing this right? Was this the right thing to say? As soon as the cameras stopped rolling, the room broke into a flurry of activity. The producer and communications team were speaking in hushed tones, and Olivia overheard snippets of conversation. "Breaking news, airline criticized. PR stunt." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. The article that had just gone live painted the airline's efforts as nothing more than a superficial attempt to save face. It questioned the authenticity of the training sessions, suggesting that the company was only doing this to appear as if they were taking responsibility. The article quickly gained traction, going viral across multiple platforms. Olivia felt a wave of despair wash over her. Just when she had started to believe that she was on the path to real change both for herself and the company, this happened. She had poured her heart out, and now it seemed like it had all been for nothing. The scrutiny, the doubts, the judgment, it was all overwhelming. Sebastian, meanwhile, was already on the phone, fielding calls from board members and shareholders. The negative press was threatening to undo all the progress they had made. He had believed in the power of transformation, both personal and institutional, but now he needed to prove that these changes weren't just for show. The pressure was mounting. He hung up from another tense call, rubbing his temples, trying to gather his thoughts. He had hoped that this initiative would inspire a shift in the company culture, but the backlash made it clear that things weren't going to be as simple as he had hoped. "This isn't over," Sebastian muttered to himself as he dialed the next number. He needed to act fast to ensure that the changes they were implementing were real, that they would be sustainable, and that they wouldn't be derailed by a few negative articles. Sebastian picked up the phone again, this time calling an emergency meeting. "We need a direct response to this," he said firmly. "We need to show the world that this isn't just a PR stunt. We need to be more transparent, more committed. Let us get the passengers involved. Let us hear their stories." The next day, Sebastian stood in front of a packed conference room at the airline's headquarters. His expression was calm, but his mind was racing. The pressure of the situation was heavy, but he was determined to keep pushing forward. "Thank you all for coming," Sebastian began, his voice steady and authoritative. "Today, we're going to hear from some of our passengers. Their stories are important, and I ask that you listen with open hearts and minds." One by one, passengers stood up to speak into the microphone. The stories they shared were raw and emotional, describing the discrimination they had faced during their travels. A young Muslim woman spoke about being asked to change seats because another passenger felt uncomfortable sitting next to her. A Latino man described being repeatedly questioned about his first-class ticket, even though it was valid. Each story was met with silence, broken only by the occasional sniffle or sharp intake of breath from the audience. Olivia sat at the back of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide as she listened to the pain in each passenger's voice. She saw herself reflected in their words, and the realization hit her hard. The hurt she had caused, the injustice she had been a part of, suddenly became all too real. She felt her heart break as the stories continued. Then Grace Williams stood up to speak. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "I remember asking for help with my bag," she said, her voice trembling. "The flight attendant looked right through me, like I wasn't even there. But when a white passenger asked for help just moments later, she was all smiles and assistance." Olivia's eyes widened in recognition. This was the same incident she had witnessed on that fateful flight with Sebastian. She felt a lump form in her throat as the woman continued. "It might seem small to some," the woman said, "but it hurt. It made me feel less than human. Like I didn't matter." Olivia couldn't stop the tears from falling. She realized, in that moment, just how deep her actions had affected people. It wasn't just about ignoring someone else's request, it was about making them feel invisible, unworthy. And it wasn't just one isolated incident, it was part of a much larger pattern that she had contributed to. The forum continued, and more stories poured out, each one striking a chord with the audience. The weight of the past actions in the airline began to sink in, and for the first time, many employees realized the impact of their behavior. Sebastian watched the room carefully, noting the reactions of the staff. He could see the guilt, the shock, and in some cases, the dawning understanding of what needed to change. As the session drew to a close, Sebastian stood up again, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all for your courage in sharing your experiences," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "This is why we're here. This is why we're making these changes, not for publicity, not for profit, but because it's the right thing to do." The room was silent for a moment before a voice broke through the tension. "I'd like to speak if I may," Olivia said, her voice shaking but determined. All eyes turned to her as she walked to the front of the room. Sebastian nodded, giving her a silent gesture of encouragement. Olivia took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice quiet but growing stronger with each word. "My name is Olivia," she began, "and I'm here to admit that I've been part of the problem." A murmur rippled through the audience, but Olivia pressed on. "I grew up in a small town where everyone looked like me," she continued, her eyes filled with remorse. "We didn't talk about diversity or inclusion. We just existed in our bubble. But when I became a flight attendant, I brought those biases with me. I didn't even realize I had them, but listening to these stories today, I see now how my actions have hurt people." Tears filled Olivia's eyes as she looked around at the faces in the room. "I've treated passengers differently based on how they looked. I've ignored some and favored others. And I'm ashamed of that." The room was silent as everyone hung on her every word. But Olivia wasn't done yet. "But being ashamed isn't enough," she said, her voice steadying. "I need to change. We all do. It's not easy to challenge beliefs we've held our whole lives, but it's necessary." She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with some of the passengers who had shared their stories. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused. And I promise from this day forward, I will do better. I will be better." A smattering of applause broke out. Some audience members nodded in appreciation, while others remained skeptical. Sebastian watched from the side, a small smile playing on his lips. He knew that Olivia's journey was far from over, but this was a crucial first step. Sebastian took a deep breath and looked around the room at the group of employees who had gathered for the company-wide meeting. It was time to put everything they had been working on into action. He had seen the resistance, but he had also seen glimpses of change, genuine, meaningful change. The initiative was no longer just about fixing the past, it was about building a future where everyone, regardless of their background or appearance, would feel respected and valued. But first, they needed to face the uncomfortable truth about the company's history and how far they still had to go. Olivia stood at the back of the room, feeling her stomach churn. This was it, she had taken a huge step in front of the cameras, but this was different. This meeting was live, and she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Her words had been met with a mix of reactions, but she also felt a new responsibility. There was no going back now, no avoiding the consequences of her actions. She had started the process of change, but the hardest part was yet to come. Sebastian started the meeting with a calm but firm tone, addressing the gathered employees. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady. "We're about to hear some important stories from passengers and colleagues who have been directly impacted by discriminatory behavior. This is not just for the press or for a quick fix. This is about creating a culture where we hold ourselves accountable and learn from our mistakes. Today is the beginning of that transformation." Olivia stood still, listening as Sebastian laid out their vision. She had heard him speak of the changes before, but hearing it in this setting surrounded by her colleagues, the passengers, the cameras made it feel all the more real. She couldn't escape it. She had to be part of this change, no matter how uncomfortable it made her feel. The first passenger who stepped up to the microphone was a young Muslim woman. She spoke about an incident in which a passenger asked her to change seats, citing discomfort about sitting next to someone who was visibly Muslim. Her voice quivered as she recounted the humiliating experience. "I felt invisible," she said. "Like I didn't belong. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I wasn't even human to that person." To the rest of the crew, I felt like a problem that needed to be dealt with. The room was silent, but Olivia could feel the weight of those words. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she listened. She had seen it happen on flights before when passengers of a certain race or religion were treated differently. But hearing it from someone else's mouth, seeing the pain in their eyes, made it real in a way nothing else had. The realization was a punch to her gut. As the woman finished speaking, the next passenger stepped forward, a Latino man. He described the multiple times he had been questioned about his first-class ticket, even though it was valid. "I shouldn't have to explain myself," he said. "But I was made to feel like I didn't deserve to be there. It's happened too many times now. I just want to feel like I'm welcome, like everyone else." Olivia felt a wave of guilt rush over her. This was the truth she had been avoiding, the ugly truth of her own behavior and the behavior of others who had stood by and let it happen. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone in that room. It was about every passenger who had ever felt uncomfortable or disrespected while flying. And she had been part of that. The next speaker was Grace Williams, her hands shaking as she took the microphone. "I remember asking for help with my bag," she said softly. "The flight attendant looked right through me, as if I wasn't even there. But when a white passenger asked for help just moments later, she was all smiles, all assistance. It was like I wasn't even a person." Olivia's eyes widened in recognition. This was the same incident she had witnessed on the flight with Sebastian, the same moment when she had made a snap judgment about a passenger and allowed her biases to influence her behavior. She had been the one who ignored the woman, just as the flight attendant in the story had done. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. The elderly woman continued, "It might seem small to some, but it hurt. It made me feel less than human. Like I didn't matter." Tears welled up in Olivia's eyes. The guilt she had been carrying now felt unbearable. She had caused pain, hurt, and humiliation, and she had never even realized the depth of it until now. The weight of it threatened to crush her. But this was what she needed. This was the awakening she had been avoiding. As the session continued, more passengers stood to share their stories. Each story was filled with raw emotion, each one piercing through Olivia's defenses. There were so many stories, so many voices, that the gravity of the situation became undeniable. The passengers who shared their experiences weren't just recounting isolated incidents, they were talking about a systemic issue that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And Olivia had been a part of that system. The forum ended with a heavy silence in the room. Sebastian stood up, his face somber. "Thank you to everyone who shared today," he said. "Your courage means more than you know. This is why we're here. We're making these changes not for profit, not for publicity, but because it's the right thing to do." The room was quiet, but a few passengers nodded in appreciation. Olivia's heart was still heavy with the weight of everything she had learned that day. She had hoped the meeting would bring some clarity, but instead, it had opened her eyes to just how deep the problem ran. As the session came to a close, a quiet voice broke through the tension. "I'd like to speak, if I may," Olivia said, her voice tentative at first, but growing more determined as she looked around the room. All eyes turned to her. Sebastian nodded, encouraging her to continue. Olivia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she stood before the group. "My name is Olivia, and I'm here to admit that I've been part of the problem." A murmur rippled through the audience, but Olivia pushed forward. "I grew up in a small town where everyone looked like me," she said. "We didn't talk about diversity or inclusion, we just existed in our bubble. And when I became a flight attendant, I brought those biases with me, even if I didn't realize it. But listening to these stories today, I see how my actions have hurt people." She paused for a moment, trying to steady herself. The weight of the room felt heavy, but the words were coming more easily now. "I've treated passengers differently based on how they looked. I've ignored some, and I've favored others. And I'm ashamed of that. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to keep going. But being ashamed isn't enough. I need to change. We all do. It's not easy to confront the beliefs we've held our whole lives, but it's necessary. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused. And I promise that from this day forward, I will do better. I will be better. A few seconds passed before the applause began. It was hesitant at first, but it grew as people began to recognize the sincerity in her words. Sebastian watched from the side, his face filled with pride. He knew this was just the beginning for Olivia, but he also knew that her journey had taken a crucial first step. There was still much work to be done, but he felt confident that this was the moment where change began to take root. Olivia stood quietly at the front of the room, a mix of humility and determination in her heart. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt hopeful about the future. As the company continued its efforts to transform, the changes were beginning to take root, but not without challenges. Sebastian stood at the front of the large conference room, addressing his team. The mood in the room was different now. There was a sense of urgency, but also a quiet hope that the initiatives they had put into motion were starting to show results. He had worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure that the right systems and structures were in place to make these changes sustainable. We've made progress, Sebastian said, his voice steady and calm. But the real test is still ahead of us. These changes can't be a one-time event. We need to keep pushing forward, make sure this is a part of our daily operations, not just something we talk about in meetings. He looked around at his team, making sure they understood. The weight of what they were doing hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about changing a few policies or adding sensitivity training to the agenda. It was about reshaping the very culture of the company. And that meant making sure the efforts reached every level, from the flight attendants to the executives. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, Olivia was facing the aftermath of her public apology. She had hoped the worst was over, that she had done what was expected of her. But as she sat in her office, preparing for the next round of training, doubts began to creep in. The road to redemption was far from straightforward. She had made a commitment to change, but now, she was beginning to feel the full weight of what that meant. Could she truly live up to the promises she had made? Or was she just going through the motions? As she went over her notes for the upcoming training session, she caught sight of a message from Sebastian on her phone. It was brief, but it was a reminder of how far she still had to go. I'm proud of what you've done so far. But this isn't over. You're just beginning. Keep pushing forward. Olivia stared at the message, feeling the pressure mount. She had taken the first steps, but now the real work had begun. She had to confront the biases and assumptions that had been ingrained in her for so long. It was easy to say the right words in front of the camera, but now, every interaction with a passenger was an opportunity to put those words into action. She couldn't let her guard down. She couldn't afford to slip back into old habits. The next few days were a blur of training sessions, feedback meetings, and one-on-one mentoring. Olivia's time was now split between participating in the new cultural sensitivity workshops and leading some of the newer employees through the same process. It was difficult, and sometimes, it felt like she was going through the motions, but there were moments when she saw a spark of understanding in her colleagues' eyes. That gave her hope. She wasn't the only one struggling with change. As the training sessions progressed, she noticed that many of her colleagues were in the same position she had been in, resistant, skeptical, and unsure of how to start. But each session, each conversation, brought them closer to understanding the importance of empathy and respect. Slowly but surely, the airline's culture was beginning to shift. Sebastian watched all of this from his office, closely monitoring the progress of both the internal changes and the external perception of the airline. He knew that the road ahead would be rocky, and that not everyone would accept the changes right away. But he was patient. He knew that deep cultural shifts took time. The work they were doing now wasn't just about implementing policies, it was about planting seeds that would take root and grow over time. Sebastian's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the communications team, updating him on the latest media coverage. The headlines had started to shift from criticism to curiosity. The public was beginning to notice the tangible efforts the airline was making. The company's cultural transformation had become a talking point in the industry, with some even calling it a model for how businesses could handle internal diversity issues. But Sebastian knew better than to rest on his laurels. Positive media coverage was just the beginning. What mattered most was how the changes were being felt by the passengers and employees. That was the true test. As he continued reading through the reports, he allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction. The changes were beginning to take hold, and for the first time in a long time, Sebastian felt a sense of hope for the future of the airline. Meanwhile, in the training room, Olivia was leading a session for a group of new hires. It was clear to her now that this was where the real work lay. This was where the culture change could happen from the ground up, with the next generation of employees. As she spoke to the group, she realized how much she had grown. The woman who stood before them was no longer the same one who had been dismissive and blind to her own biases. This was a new Olivia, one who was committed to doing better. After the session, one of the trainees, a young man named Ethan, approached her. He was one of the quieter ones, often keeping to himself during the discussions. But today, he had something to say. "Olivia, I just wanted to thank you for being so open with us. I think a lot of us here have struggled with some of the same things you've talked about. Your honesty really helped me understand what it means to treat people with respect." Olivia smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment that she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't about getting approval or accolades, it was about knowing that the work she was doing was making a difference. "You're welcome, Ethan," she said, her voice warm. "We all have work to do, but every step we take is a step in the right direction." As the weeks went by, the changes at the airline became more and more evident. Passengers began to report improved experiences, noting the increased sensitivity and professionalism of the flight attendants. The company's internal feedback system was gathering data, and the results were promising. Employee morale was rising, and the culture was shifting. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Real progress. Sebastian knew that they had only scratched the surface, but for the first time, he felt optimistic. The journey wasn't over, and there were still hurdles to overcome, but they were on the right path. Olivia stood outside the training room one afternoon, watching the new employees filter in for their session. She felt a deep sense of pride. The woman who had once been skeptical and resistant to change had now become a part of the solution. She had learned something important: change didn't happen overnight, but with each effort, no matter how small, it became a little bit easier. And for the first time, she truly believed in the possibility of lasting transformation, not just for the airline, but for herself, too. Sebastian watched from the doorway, noticing Olivia standing there, her back straight, her demeanor confident. It was a quiet moment, but it was one that spoke volumes. They had both come a long way, and though the journey ahead would be long, they had proven that real change was possible when people were willing to confront their past, embrace the truth, and take responsibility. As he walked away, he knew they had set something in motion that could change the industry. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about the willingness to keep moving forward, to continue growing, and to build a future where respect and inclusivity were at the heart of everything they did. The ripple effect had begun, and there was no turning back now.